They say you never forget the meals that kept you alive. Not the feasts, not the fine dining, but the plain, strange, and sometimes downright desperate foods that arrived on the table when times were hardest. The Great Depression wasn't just a story of Wall Street crashes and breadlines. It was a story lived out in kitchens, around wooden tables, in crowded tenements and rural farmhouses. It was a story told one meal at a time. Between 1929 and the late 1930s, food became more than just sustenance. It became survival. Millions of families suddenly faced empty pantries, failing farms, and wages that could no longer buy enough to eat. Mothers stretched one potato into a pot of stew, fathers stood in soup kitchen lines with empty tin cups, and children learned to be grateful for even the simplest bite. It was a time when creativity in the kitchen wasn't optional. It was the only way to keep hunger at bay. What makes these Depression-era meals so unforgettable is not their flavor, but what they represented. A sandwich made of onions, a pie baked with crackers instead of apples, or a thin cabbage soup might sound strange, even laughable, to us today. But to those who lived through the 1930s, these humble dishes carried the weight of survival. They told the story of families pulling together, of neighbors sharing what little they had, of making something out of almost nothing. And yet, there's a surprising nostalgia here. Many of these recipes lingered long after the Depression ended. Some became comfort foods, passed down from generation to generation. Others disappeared almost overnight, remembered only in faded cookbooks or whispered family stories. In this film, we'll journey back into the kitchens of Depression-era America. We'll uncover the meals that ordinary people relied on, the tricks they used to stretch ingredients, and the strange but ingenious recipes that carried them through the darkest of days. These aren't just foods of the past. They are living reminders of resilience, resourcefulness, and the stubborn will to survive. So let's step back into that world of scarcity and strength and discover the 25 Great Depression meals Americans actually survived on. Point 1. Hoover Stew. It was called Hoover Stew, a name that carried both irony and bitterness. Families who gathered around steaming bowls of this hodgepodge weren't feasting. They were surviving. The stew was nothing more than macaroni, hot dogs, canned tomatoes, and beans boiled together into one pot. Cheap, filling, and easy to stretch, it became a symbol of Depression-era ingenuity. The name came as a jab at President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the economic collapse. For the millions standing in soup kitchen lines, a bowl of Hoover stew was often all they had. At community centers and church basements, giant vats of the stuff bubbled away, ladled out to hungry men, women, and children who could no longer afford meat or fresh produce. What made it special was not its flavor. By most accounts, it was bland, salty, and heavy, but what it represented. This simple stew gave families just enough calories to keep going another day. Children grew up remembering it not as a delicacy, but as a strange mixture that kept their bellies from aching at night. And yet, there's an almost nostalgic comfort tied to it now. Some families carried the recipe forward, serving it as a reminder of how their parents and grandparents endured hardship. For others, it disappeared as soon as times got better, a dish no one wanted to remember. Still, Hoover Stew lives on as one of the most iconic Depression-era meals. A recipe born of scarcity, but remembered as proof that even in the hardest times, Americans found a way to make something out of almost nothing. From macaroni and hot dogs, we move to something far stranger. A sandwich, so bare bones, it shocks us even today, the onion sandwich. Point 2. Onion sandwiches. Sometimes, survival came down to 2 slices of bread and whatever could be found in between. For many families in the Great Depression, that meant nothing more than a raw onion. The onion sandwich, if you could even call it that, was exactly what it sounds like: thick slices of onion tucked between bread, sprinkled with a little salt, and eaten as a meal. To modern ears, it almost sounds like a cruel joke. But in the 1930s, when meat was a luxury and vegetables were scarce, onions were cheap, filling, and widely available. Their sharp, biting flavor gave the illusion of something more substantial, a poor man's substitute for the roast beef or pork that once filled the table. In city apartments and rural farmhouses alike, onion sandwiches became both a symbol of struggle and a bitter reminder of what had been lost. Children went to school with them wrapped in paper, embarrassed to open their lunch. Adults ate them in silence, grateful for food at all, but always wishing for something better. And yet, there's a strange dignity in the memory of these sandwiches. They spoke of resilience, of families who refused to go hungry, even if all they had was bread, an onion, and determination. Some even dressed them up with vinegar, lard, or drippings when they could, turning desperation into a kind of creativity. Today, onion sandwiches stand out as one of the starkest reminders of Depression-era life, a meal that wasn't about taste or comfort, but about survival itself. But not all Depression meals were so plain. In fact, some tried to mimic the foods people longed for most. Next, we'll uncover the surprising story of a pie made without apples, the legendary mock apple pie. Point 3. Mock apple pie, made with crackers? There is perhaps no dessert more American than apple pie. But during the Great Depression, apples became scarce and expensive, out of reach for most struggling families. And yet, the craving for pie never went away. That's when resourceful home cooks turned to a surprising substitute, saltine crackers. Thus, the mock apple pie was born. The recipe sounds almost unbelievable. Housewives would line a pie crust with broken crackers, then pour over a syrup made from sugar, cinnamon, lemon juice, and sometimes cream of tartar. When baked, the crackers softened and absorbed the spice syrup, taking on the texture and even the flavor of cooked apples. To children and guests, it could pass for the real thing, at least for a fleeting moment. This dish was more than a trick of the tongue. It was a testament to resilience. Mock apple pie allowed families to preserve a sense of tradition, to celebrate a holiday or Sunday dinner with something sweet, even when the pantry was bare. In a time when most meals were about filling the stomach, a slice of this fake pie gave people a taste of normalcy and hope. And surprisingly, it didn't vanish after the Depression. Ritz Crackers famously printed the recipe on their boxes for decades, a reminder of how a dish born in hardship became an enduring piece of American food history. To some, mock apple pie was a miracle. To others, it was a bittersweet reminder of how little they had. But either way, it remains one of the most iconic examples of Depression-era ingenuity, proof that the spirit of apple pie could survive, even when apples themselves could not. From a pie that wasn't really pie, we move to a dish that carried a far different legacy, salty, filling, and forever tied to soldiers and struggling families alike: creamed chipped beef on toast. Point 4. Creamed chipped beef on toast is. Few Depression-era meals carry as much memory, or as many nicknames, as creamed chipped beef on toast. To families of the 1930s, it was a cheap, filling dish. To soldiers in the barracks, it was known simply as S.S., a phrase that can't quite be repeated in polite company. The meal was simple: dried or salted beef, chopped into small pieces, stretched in a thick white gravy of flour, milk, and fat, then poured over toasted bread. It was salty, heavy, and endlessly adaptable. Families who couldn't afford beef sometimes used ham scraps, sausage, or even vegetables instead. What mattered most was that the gravy stretched whatever meat they had to feed more mouths. Its popularity came from necessity. Dried beef was shelf-stable and cheap, and flour was one of the few ingredients most families always had. For many children, this dish became a breakfast staple, steaming gravy over toast served before long days of school or work. For soldiers and veterans of World War II, it carried a different kind of memory, a reminder of mess hall meals, equal parts comfort and monotony. And yet, despite its reputation as bland or even dreaded, creamed chipped beef endured long after the Depression. Diners served it, school cafeterias offered it, and military cooks kept it alive. To some, it was a taste of home. To others, a symbol of hard times they'd rather forget. Still, SOS stands as one of the most enduring depression meals, proof that when times were lean, even scraps could be transformed into something warm, filling, and familiar. Asterisk, but not every depression meal came from the pantry. Some were pulled straight from the ground outside the back door. Next, we'll uncover the surprising story of dandelion salad. Asterisk. Point 5. Dandelion salad. In the Great Depression, the line between food and weed often disappeared. When store shelves were bare and gardens sparse, many families turned to the unlikeliest of ingredients, the humble dandelion. What most people considered a nuisance in the yard became a lifeline in the kitchen. Dandelion greens were foraged from fields, sidewalks, and backyards, washed carefully, and served raw in salads or boiled to soften their bitter bite. Sometimes they were dressed with vinegar, bacon grease, or even just a sprinkle of salt. For families with no money for fresh produce, these wild greens provided vitamins and minerals that were otherwise hard to come by. There was something almost symbolic about it. At a time when people felt stripped of choices, nature quietly offered one for free. Children were often sent out with baskets to gather dandelions by hand. Neighbors swapped tips on how to prepare them. And while no one would call the taste luxurious, the greens kept families healthy enough to endure. The irony, of course, is that dandelions were, and still are, everywhere. What we treat today as a weed sprayed with chemicals was once treated as a vital food source. For many depression survivors, the taste of dandelion salad carried a bittersweet memory. The flavor of hardship, yes, but also of survival and resilience. Even today, some communities still prepare dandelion greens as part of cultural food traditions. But for those who lived through the 1930s, it wasn't about tradition at all. It was about survival, plain and simple. From wild weeds to a far more familiar staple, our next meal shows just how far one humble crop could be stretched. The potato, turned into countless Depression-era dishes. Point 6. Potato pancakes and potato everything. If there was one ingredient that defined the Great Depression, it was the potato. Cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile, potatoes were the backbone of countless meals when little else could be found. From soups and stews to casseroles and simple boiled chunks, potatoes became the workhorse of the American kitchen. One of the most beloved ways families stretched them was through potato pancakes. Grated raw potatoes mixed with flour, egg, and sometimes onion were fried in a pan until golden brown. Crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, they were hearty enough to serve as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. For many families, they were one of the few meals that actually felt like a treat, warm, satisfying, and just indulgent enough to break the monotony of soups and stews. But potato pancakes were only the beginning. Leftover mashed potatoes became dumplings. Potato peels were boiled for broth. Thin slices were fried in lard to mimic the luxury of chips. Nothing went to waste. A single sack of potatoes could stretch for weeks, feeding large families who had nothing else to rely on. The potato's strength was not just in its calories, but in its adaptability. It could be dressed up with butter and cream when times were better, or served plain with only salt when times were lean. And in both cases, it filled hungry bellies and bought families another day of survival. For many Depression survivors, the potato became a symbol of endurance, humble, reliable, and always there when needed. From the sturdy potato, we moved to a meal that was far softer, a dish meant to comfort young and old alike: milk toast. Point 7. Milk toast. Sometimes, the simplest meals carried the most comfort. For families in the Great Depression, one of those meals was milk toast. It was nothing more than stale bread softened in a bowl of warm milk, sometimes sprinkled with sugar or cinnamon if those were on hand. But for children and weary adults alike, it was a dish that brought warmth to otherwise cold, hungry days. Milk toast wasn't new to the Depression. It had been served in America for generations. But in the 1930s, it took on new meaning. Bread was often old or left over, and milk was sometimes watered down to stretch it further. Yet together, They created something that felt gentle, nourishing, and safe. For children, it was often the first meal given when they were sick. For adults, it was a reminder that even with very little, a touch of comfort could still be found. The emotional weight of milk toast wasn't in its taste, but in its simplicity. At a time when lavish meals were impossible, this humble dish gave families a sense of care. Parents who had nothing else to offer could still hand a warm bowl to their children. In many households, it became more than food. It was a memory of kindness in the midst of struggle. Today, milk toast has largely faded from American tables, remembered mostly in old cookbooks or family stories. But for Depression survivors, it was unforgettable. A reminder that even the barest of meals could carry the feeling of home. From the softness of milk toast, we move to a meal that was far more inventive, one that showed just how far Americans could stretch a simple jar of peanut butter. Point 8. Peanut butter stretchers. During the Great Depression, protein was one of the hardest things to come by. Meat was expensive, eggs weren't always available, and beans only went so far. That's where peanut butter stepped in. Cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, it became a Depression-era hero. But families didn't just spread it on bread, they learned to stretch it in every way possible. Peanut butter sandwiches became more than just peanut butter and jelly. Some families paired it with lettuce, mustard, or even mayonnaise to bulk it up. Others stirred spoonfuls into soups or stews to thicken the broth and add a little extra nutrition. In some households, peanut butter was mixed with oats or flour to make simple cookies or bars, a rare sweet treat in lean times. It may sound strange today, but these stretchers weren't about taste, they were about survival. Every spoonful of peanut butter could be made to go further, feeding more mouths with fewer ingredients. Children grew up on these unusual sandwiches, while parents quietly marveled at how one jar could last weeks when used wisely. Peanut butter also carried a sense of comfort. Unlike onion sandwiches or cabbage soup, it had a richness that felt satisfying, almost indulgent. For many, it was the closest thing to a luxury they could afford. Looking back, these peanut butter stretchers are remembered with a mix of nostalgia and amazement. They were simple, strange, and sometimes surprisingly tasty. But most importantly, they proved that even in the hardest of times, Americans found ways to make the most out of the little they had. From the richness of peanut butter, we now turn to something much plainer, a meal that filled countless bowls with almost nothing but water and cabbage. Point 9. Cabbage soup. If there was one meal that embodied the word stretch, it was cabbage soup. In kitchens across America during the Great Depression, giant pots simmered on stovetops, filled mostly with water, onions, and a few chunks of cabbage. For many families, it wasn't just dinner, it was survival. Cabbage was cheap, filling, and widely available. A single head could be boiled down to make soup that lasted for days. If families were lucky, they might toss in a potato, a carrot, or a bone for flavor. But more often than not, it was little more than broth and cabbage leaves, ladled out night after night to keep hunger at bay. This was not food made for pleasure. It was food made to endure. Mothers could serve bowl after bowl, stretching one pot to feed 6, 8, even 10 mouths. The flavor was plain, even bitter, but the warmth mattered more than the taste. Children grew up with the memory of cabbage soup as both a comfort and a burden, something they hated to eat, but knew they couldn't live without. Yet in its simplicity, cabbage soup carried a quiet dignity. It kept families alive. It proved that even with almost nothing, there was still something to put on the table. And for those who lived through those years, the smell of simmering cabbage would forever be tied to memories of both hardship and resilience. Even today, cabbage soup recipes survive, some dressed up with spices and meats, far richer than their Depression-era ancestors. But in the 1930s, this humble soup was more than just food. It was a lifeline. Asterisk from a pot of plain cabbage, we turn now to meals that were even starker, sandwiches filled not with meat or vegetables, but with whatever scraps could be found. The nothing sandwiches of the Depression. Asterisk. Point 10. Ketchup sandwiches and other nothing sandwiches. In the Great Depression, hunger often forced people to redefine what counted as a meal. And few foods captured that desperation more than the so-called nothing sandwiches. One of the most remembered versions was the ketchup sandwich, 2 slices of bread with nothing but ketchup in between. It was exactly what it sounds like. Bread was cheap, and ketchup could be bought for a few cents a bottle. Together, they created the illusion of something hearty, when in truth, it was little more than sugar, vinegar, and starch. Children often carried them to school, embarrassed yet grateful. Parents ate them in silence, wishing they had more to offer. But ketchup wasn't the only filler. Families also made mustard sandwiches, mayonnaise sandwiches, or even lard and grease sandwiches, anything that could add a bit of flavor to otherwise empty bread. In rural areas, drippings saved from cooking meat weeks before might be spread thinly to mimic butter. It wasn't luxury, it was survival. The emotional weight of these nothing sandwiches is heavy even today. They are remembered as a last resort, a symbol of just how little many families had. And yet, for those who lived through it, they also carried a strange sense of resilience. With almost nothing in the cupboard, people still managed to put food, however humble, between 2 slices of bread. Looking back, these sandwiches are shocking to us, but for Depression survivors, they were simply reality. They remind us that sometimes, even the smallest bite can mean the difference between going hungry and going on. Asterisk, and with that, we've reached the end of our journey through 10 of the most memorable meals of the Great Depression. But the story they tell goes far beyond food itself. Asterisk. The meals of the Great Depression were never meant to be glamorous. They were not crafted by chefs or remembered for their flavors. Instead, they were born of necessity, from empty cupboards, from thin wallets, and from the determination of families who refused to give up. From pots of Hoover stew simmering in church basements, to the sharp bite of onion sandwiches carried in a school lunch, to the strange comfort of milk toast or peanut butter stretched as far as it would go, these dishes told the quiet story of survival. They were more than food. They were proof of endurance, of creativity, and of the unshakable will to carry on through some of the darkest days America has ever seen. And yet, for all their plainness, many of these meals are remembered with a kind of bittersweet nostalgia. For those who lived through the 1930s, each bite carried not just hunger, but family. Neighbors sharing cabbage soup. Mothers baking a pie from crackers to give their children the taste of tradition. Fathers scraping together sandwiches of ketchup or lard so no one would go to bed with an empty stomach. These meals remind us that history is not only written in speeches or battles, but in kitchens, around dinner tables, and in the resourcefulness of everyday people. The Great Depression was survived not just with strength and courage, but with recipes that stretched the impossible into enough. Today, we may look back with disbelief, even shock, at what people ate to survive. But perhaps the deeper lesson is this: even in times of scarcity, there is resilience. Even in hardship, there is creativity. And even in the leanest years, there can still be moments of comfort, shared over the simplest of meals. This has been the World Tapestry. If you found this journey meaningful, I invite you to subscribe, share your memories or family recipes in the comments, and join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten stories of America's past, one meal, one memory, and one story at a time. These meals may seem humble, even shocking, to us now. But to those who lived through the Great Depression, they were more than just recipes. They were survival, resourcefulness, and resilience on a plate. They remind us of a time when families leaned on each other, when neighbors shared what little they had, and when creativity turned scraps into supper. As we look back on Hoover stew, onion sandwiches, and mock apple pie made from crackers, we're reminded that history isn't just found in books or headlines. It's found in kitchens, in the meals that carried people through, and in the stories that parents and grandparents passed down. These forgotten foods are more than curiosities. They are testaments to human endurance. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson they leave us with: Even when times are hard, even when cupboards are bare, there is always a way forward. Always a way to make something out of almost nothing. This has been the World Tapestry. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to subscribe and join us for more stories of forgotten recipes, vanished traditions, and nostalgic moments from America's history. And if your family has its own Depression-era recipes or memories, share them in the comments below. Because keeping these stories alive is how we honor the people who lived them. Until next time, thank you for watching and remembering.